Hello, everyone. Good evening. Tonight, we start the beginning of a new series on this channel, the Chatham House version, a deep dive into the work and essays of Elie Kedourie. I'm very lucky to be joined for this series by Hunger the Dye Merchant. How are you this evening?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me as always.
Splendid. And for those who are watching, you may remember that we've brought up Elie Kedourie in previous streams. I think the very first one was when we were talking about Spengler and Magian civilization, which is when you first introduced Kedourie to me, Hunger. Would you also like to elaborate about how you actually discovered Kedourie?
Yeah, we've mentioned him a couple times over our streams together, and the interesting story of how I found Elie Kedourie was it was actually a recommendation by Moldbug Curtis Yarvin that I had met him for a brief period of time in Washington D.C. There was a small gathering and meet up there, and he was talking with fans of his writing, and we got to talking about the Middle East for a few minutes. And he recommended to me. I was like, "Have you read Elie Kedourie?" And I was like, "No, I haven't." Like, who is Elie Kedourie? And he was like, "Okay, you have to read the Chatham House version. It explains so much about British policy in the Middle East and what happened, like what led to the consequences that we're dealing with today." And so I picked it up after his recommendation, and the first chapter of this book, which we're going to get into, I was sold immediately. It's one of the most reactionary 10 pages I've ever read, and I could totally understand why someone like Moldbug Curtis Yarvin would instantly recommend something like that.
No, well, thank you for that introduction. And yes, I think it's also worth just sort of discussing who Elie Kedourie was. So he was born in to the Kingdom of Iraq in 1926, and he was actually an Oriental Jew, or Mizrahi, to use the proper term for an Oriental Jew. And so he was born there, and he often felt quite alienated because, as you know, Iraq for the previous several hundred years had been broken up into three provinces of the Ottoman Empire. You've got the Basra province in the south, Baghdad province in the middle, and then you've got Mosul province in the north. And so it spent this and before then it had been part of the Persian Empire and various other Middle Eastern empires. And Iraq, though being known as an Arab country, is actually quite diverse. There's many minorities. So not only do you have the Jewish community, which goes all the way back to the time of Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon and the Babylonian captivity. But you also have other groups like the Assyrians, which are Iraqi Christians, and then you've also got the Kurds as well. So you've got a real sort of hodgepodge of different peoples, as you do have throughout the Middle East. And his beef really with the Kingdom of Iraq is that you've essentially got this Arab nationalist construct on a very kind of ethnically and culturally diverse region, and then this new Arab nationalist government just wanted to just spend all its resources on just promoting Arab nationalism, which, as you can understand, not everybody in the kingdom wanted. And then when they didn't obey, it just spent all its force on crushing them quite brutally. And as a result of this, and also with the rise of Israel and the creation of a Jewish state in the Middle East, relations between Arabs and Jews soured, and a lot of the Oriental Jews had to flee their respective countries and then move to Israel. In Kedourie's case, he actually came to Britain and he actually studied at in Britain, and actually spent most of his academic career teaching at the London School of Economics. And there's also a very interesting anecdote I found out is that he actually was trying to get a Doctor of Philosophy at Oxford, and he failed to get it because his university professors wanted him to make amendments to his PhD thesis, which he refused to do. And one of his examiners was none other than the prominent Orientalist H.A.R. Gibb, who we talked about Hunger on our previous streams on Orientalism, which I think it was a bit of an interesting coincidence.
Oh yeah, and his thesis was rejected because it totally went against the Orientalist view of the Arabs, and Kedourie was very unapologetic in his view that, you know, Britain, you screwed up, you made numerous mistakes and numerous false assumptions that led to terrible consequences, and he was directly telling this to the face of the Orientalists who had shaped Britain's, Middle Eastern policy in the Foreign Office. Like, these people were literally working in the Foreign Office, and he was telling them in his thesis, like, you screwed up and it's your fault, and in so many words.
No, absolutely. And I think to sort of give people the broad view of Kadouri's worldview, when looking at the tragedy of the modern Middle East, essentially the traditional kind of view of Britain's empire and role in the Middle East more specifically was that it was a disaster because, quote, the West and Britain is evil, colonial overlords that just wants to extract the area of resources and abuse its people. And the Middle Easterners, the Arabs, are some poor victimized group who we have to defend and sympathize with.
The noble
What could,
savage.
in yes, indeed, to quote Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But what Kadouri's view counterpoint to this is that actually the British Empire was not as bad as you would think, and that he actually thinks the British are too hard on themselves, and really when they were kind of acting pragmatically and in their own sort of interests, that was when the Middle East was best governed, and that where they're to blame is for spreading ideas like Arab nationalism into the area, because you then get tragedies such as the Assyrian genocide and the expulsion of the Mizrahi Jews, and also a lot of the conflicts that we still see to this day regarding the Israelis and the Palestinians. And so, in a way, you can almost say that his view is an expression I've used before, which is whenever anything goes wrong, you can't just blame one party. It takes two to tango, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. And his issue with the British Empire wasn't that, and this is what makes Kaduri stand out among, all the critics of, Western Middle East policy. This is what makes him very unique and very reactionary. He says it's not the problem isn't imperialism. Imperialism is a way of life. Imperialism is as natural as, the sun rising and falling and setting. His problem with the British foreign policy was that it was too idealist. It was too romantic. It made these liberal assumptions of the Arabs and of the people and state that was the state of the Middle East and the things that were happening within the Ottoman Empire. And they sided with the oppressed, the poor oppressed Arabs being being under the heel of the Ottoman Empire. And he just says, no, this is incorrect. This is false. He mentions explicitly in the book that people in the High British Office in Egypt and Sudan and in the Foreign Office in London, they had they had been infected by Gladstonian liberalism, and Gladstonian liberalism was national liberalism, and that's what they were trying to create in the Middle East.
No, thank you. And it's interesting you bring up Gladstonian liberalism because, to give an example of that, it makes me think of in the 1870s, you had the Russo-Turkish War, and what's interesting is around this time, because you had Benjamin Disraeli as British Prime Minister, and he was someone who still was interested in trying to prop up the Ottoman Empire against Russian expansionism. And obviously, for those who don't know, he was leader of the Tory party, and then his main political rival was Gladstone, the leader of the Liberal Party, and both men absolutely hated each other. Their rivalry is one of the most famous political rivalries in history. And I remember,
Absolutely.
Gladstone absolutely sort of chimped when around this time, because one of the causes was alleged Ottoman atrocities against Bulgarians, and Gladstone went on this massive tirade, like writing all these pamphlets saying the evil barbaric Turk, we must kick the Turks out of the Balkans, we must allow the Russians in to destroy these barbaric Orientals.
Yeah. And that's what's so ironic about it. I mean, Kedourie explicitly states that this project was imperial liberalism. He literally uses the phrase liberalism in a book that was published, I want to say 40, 50 years ago. And the I should explain the Chatham House version like very briefly. The Chatham House version was his doctoral thesis that failed to get him the Oxford PhD. But the book you're looking at on your screen right now is an anthology of many of his essays, being and the final chapter of that book being the famous Chatham House version. But it's a huge collection of essays on his writings on the Arab history and on British Arab relations in the early 20th century. And so the Chatham House version is just the most famous chapter of this book that failed to get him his PhD.
Indeed, and just to quickly go over that, so what is the Chatham House version? Well, it's what we've been discussing. It's this view of history that the British and the West are to blame for the problems of the Middle East, and they're just some victim group. And what's interesting, and I think one of the reasons why I think Kedourie stirred up the hornet's nest in the academia world is that one of his main people he criticises is none other than Arnold Toynbee, the author of the Study of History. And the reason he does this is, for those who don't know, other than being an eminent historian in his own right, Toynbee was actually the director at Chatham House, which is the informal name for the Institute of International Affairs, which is a British think tank, which it's kind of like a British equivalent of what's the American equivalent of like foreign policy? Is it just foreign policy expert?
There's many of them. There's so many to like I can't even name them all. There's the Atlantic Council. There's I mean Cato is the libertarian one, but there's one thing I know what you're talking about. There's one very famous, foreign policy think tank that every Democrat and many Republicans follow religiously, and that they get all of their ideas from this one think tank. Is it the center of what is it? I'm going to Google this real quick. It's bothering me.
Yeah, because I think we mentioned it on our streams on Orientalism.
Council of Foreign Relations. The Council of Foreign Relations.
Yeah, that was it. The reason is when we talked about Edward Said, he was actually a member of that think tank, which is why it came to my mind. So,
surprise.
Indeed. And so Chatham House, and so while Toynbee was the director, they put out this kind of monthly sort of journal, the Journal of International Affairs, and Toynbee was the editor of the journal. So there were many essays in this journal which were written by him, but also by many others as well. And so essentially, this sort of narrative that Kedourie's critiquing was laid out in these various essays. And as part of the research for the stream, Hunger, I'd actually tried to look and see if I could find any of these old essays, because the Chatham House website is still up and there are actually archives of these old essays, but unfortunately you have to be like a paid member in order to read them, sadly. I don't know.
Of course.
I will say I might try and do this at some later point, but you've got JSTOR, which is a website that has a lot of essays on it from various academia, so maybe there's some Chatham House essays kicking about on JSTOR I might be able to rustle up at some point.
You can definitely find these essays if you have like an academic access to these archives.
No, certainly. And I mean, we'll probably get to that later in the series, the actual Chatham House essay itself, but I think it's a really interesting essay, and all I'll say is, because he comments on a lot of Toynbee's view of history, but I think Toynbee was a very good historian in terms of his thesis of cyclical history, but I do agree he probably was a bit sentimental when it came to sort of the modern British Empire. So without further ado, I think it's worth we now get into the first essay we're going to discuss tonight, which is the first essay. It's called "The Middle East and the Powers." So,
could I briefly just mention one more thing about Kedourie?
Yes.
I just want to mention very briefly. Kedourie has a very interesting legacy in these intellectual circles and the intellectual spaces when it comes to the Middle East, and his legacy is very I don't want to say controversial, but what I'll say is he was a very prolific writer. He wrote almost a dozen books on many topics, all of them about history or political science, and specifically on the Arabs. But he's one of those authors where both, you know, liberals, neocons, and reactionaries have found, their have found something within Kedourie's writings that they can use for their own ideology. Like, for example, he wrote a book in 1960 called Nationalism, and it's a very anti-nationalist book. This book called Nationalism, and you'll see it cited by many liberal progressives about, like, oh, the dangers of nationalism. That's one example. There's another book about democracy in the Middle East, which he wrote, I believe, in the early '90s, shortly before he died. Where you can read it in a way that's very sympathetic to neoconservatism, and that what the neoconservatives were trying to do, they use this book as kind of a map, as kind of a roadmap to kick off the Arab Spring in some ways. So his influence is very large, and it's affected different people in the academic, political sphere. But for the purposes of this stream, the Chatham House version and its accompanying essays is very much a reactionary work. And he's always more nuanced. That's the thing about Kedourie and his writing. Even though these other ideologies can take away something from him, he's always much more nuanced. He's always much more intelligent than the people that are taking his work.
Well, I would say that I don't see him so much as a reactionary. I'd see him as someone who is operating in the tradition of a Machiavelli, as someone who is just looking things as facts on the ground in a realistic view. He doesn't care for ideology or idealism. He just wants to get to the brutal, honest truth of what happens.
No, that's a fair point. He despises ideology and, liberal pretensions, and many of those accompanying anti-realist, ideas.
And it's interesting you saying that all these different people, liberals cherry pick what they want from him, and neoconservatives cherry pick what they want. It's I think he might be turning in his grave, like Orwell, that his work is being taken as an instruction manual and not a warning. So.
Oh yes, it's a big tragedy. Yes, I don't believe he would agree with a single iota of any American or British foreign policy for the past 100 years.
No. And yeah, so for this essay, the Middle East and the power. So in this essay, he's mostly talking about the role the great powers of the West or the world at large have taken in their relationship to the Middle East. And I just want to start by reading a couple of paragraphs on the first page of this essay. So, ever since the 19th century, when so-called reforms were initiated in the Ottoman Empire, there have not been wanting Western ministers and diplomats to look on Middle Eastern politics with hope and expectancy. It is quite common knowledge that in the last 100 years, the Middle East has been seen no quiet, that disturbance has succeeded disturbance, and that violent, categorical men have followed each other to prescribe and apply drastic but unavailing remedies. It might therefore seem more prudent to assume that the distemper of the modern East is not a passing one, that its political instability is rather the outcome of a deep social and intellectual crisis, when the schemes of the reformer and the goodwill of the philanthropist can scarcely assuage or modify. And yet the sober assumption that Middle Eastern instability is today endemic has found little favour either in Britain or in America. The prevalent fashion has been to proclaim the latest revolution as the herald of a new day, and the newest turbulence as the necessary and beneficent prelude to the epoch of orderliness and justice. The Mellorism of Western liberals, the activist categories, and the hopeful concepts of their political science go far to explain such an attitude, as also their conviction that a stable, universal peace will ensure only when the world is composed of democratic and progressive nation states. Whatever the truth of this dogma, it is not one which a statesman would entertain, and indeed it is irrelevant to him whether the events with which he has to cope are milestones on the road leading somewhere or mere variations on an internal theme eternally repeated. So essentially, what he's getting at there is this Western sort of expectancy of we just educate them in the ways of liberalism and progressivism, things will just get better and and then they are horribly shocked when it doesn't quite turn out that way.
Yeah, and I mean that there's so much there. It's a very realist passage right there, and I think one of the things he hits the nail on, hits the head on the nail on the head, is what does he say? The deep um the deep social and intellectual crisis, which the schemes of the reformer and the goodwill of the philanthropist can scarcely assuage or modify. He's absolutely correct, and this is not just a Western phenomenon. This is very much an Arab phenomenon as well. The intellectual, the Arab intelligentsia and the Western intelligentsia, when talking about the Arab world, is so full of distortions and false truths and liberal presumptions and universalism and progressive. It's very progressive. Like it's kind of shocking if you read Middle Eastern intelligentsias. They're like people like Edward Said. They're infected with Western idealism, and this is not native. This is not native to the Arab world. And he talks about this crisis in that way of thinking.
Indeed, and that actually segues nicely into the next point I wanted to bring up, because when we talked about Said in the streams on Orientalism, we went over the fact that in Said's background, he was raised a Protestant, which is seems very aberrant when you look at the religious makeup of the Middle East, because it's predominantly, if not Muslim, if it's Christian, it's either Orthodox or Catholic. And how did Protestantism get there? Well, it was through the American missionary movement, which is something Kedourie comments on, and essentially how you get the emergence of American influence in the Middle East is through this missionary movement. And what's even more remarkable with these missionaries is that despite, obviously with missionary, what's the purpose of one? Well, it's to go on a mission and to spread the word of Jesus Christ and Christianity to convert the population. But this is not what these missionaries were doing. They instead were trying to propagate Western ideas of liberalism and progressivism to these rather traditionalist Arabs. So rather than being religious missionaries, they were ideological missionaries, as absurd as that sounds.
And this is how I picked up this book from Moldbug, because Moldbug wrote many essays on the American missionary movement and on the influence of the American Protestant idea and how it affected, their politics, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I'm going to read that passage on missionaries in the Middle East because it's so, pertinent to this entire situation that comes afterward. And the people who started the missionary movement, they started the American University of Beirut, they started the American University of Cairo. They educated, the intellectual class of Arabs that came up in the 20th century, who became nationalists and took over the country and took over from British and French imperialism. I'm going to read that passage on the missionaries.
Sure, go for it.
But when recent British and American policies in the Middle East are considered, together with the doctrines and principles which justify them, then it is realized with a large part verbal traps and dubious dogmas have had in the construction of doctrines and the shaping of policies. The reasons for this are many. The fact that the Middle East is remote, that its traditions and its codes of behavior are alien, should not by itself have necessarily led to misunderstanding. The unfamiliar may invite caution as well as recklessness. But in the case of the remoteness, meant that it was difficult and in many cases impractical to judge and to criticize in the light of common sense and experience certain interpretations of Middle Eastern history and politics offered to the Americans and the British by interpreters who seemed expert and well placed, aka the Orientalists. Among the most influential of these in America are the missionaries. Their case is curious. They went out to proselytize and have stayed to sympathize. To America, they began since some 50 years ago to the present. This book was written in, I believe, 1960. So 50 years ago being around 1910. They began some 50 years ago to the present to present a picture of Islam as a strict Unitarian version of Protestantism, democratic and egalitarian. The task before Christians, they said, was not to make converts from Islam to Christianity. Wow. It was rather to lean over Middle Eastern society with compassion, to take it by the hand and rescue it from centuries of superstition, corruption, and tyranny. Essentially and basically, Islam was enlightened and progressive. The Western education which they, the missionaries, provided would serve to make Muslims aware of the true value of their religion and to inculcate in them a sense of brotherhood towards Christians who, after all, worship, albeit in their own manner, the same true God as the Muslims. And in fact, it is asserted that this is what is more and more happening in the Middle East. Enlightenment is spreading, the rulers are acquiring public conscience, and democracy becomes stronger every day. To take recent instance of the attitudes of these missionaries, the time seems ripe, writes Reverend Eric W. Bethman, director of the Department of Research and Publications of the American Friends of the Middle East, to usher in the new era of cooperation, a cooperation based on mutual respect for and esteem of the deep spiritual qualities inherent in both religions. The qualities are a part of every believing Muslim and every believing Christian, finding in each their deepest realization in prayer. And where prayer, love, and mercy dwell, there God is dwelling too. I cannot think of anything. This is it's not surprising we had the Arab Spring, given and the involvement of the U.S. State Department in the Arab Spring, given a passage like that, because the American missionary movement was the precursor to the State Department and the foreign organizations that went out to proselytize Christianity, but instead proselytized liberalism. And the modern Arab Spring was just the most recent example of that.
No, indeed, and that quote, because I have it written here. Islam was enlightened and progressive. Well, you heard it here, folks, from the horse's mouth. I mean, the
In
consequences.
1960.
Yes, and I think the consequence of we see the manifestation of that in people like do you remember Linda Sarsour?
Yes. Ugh.
Yeah, essentially, you've got this Muslim woman who walks around wearing the niqab or whatever it's called, but she's just got like these shit-lib views. It's like this unholy fusion of like third world Islam and like liberal progressivism.
Yeah, the entire Islam is enlightened and progressive. It's a liberal Protestant psyop. It was literally a liberal Protestant psyop by American missionaries 100 years ago. It's shocking. It's absolutely insane.
Well, what's even stranger, Hunger, is that this phenomenon you could actually argue goes back to the 16th century, because when the Protestant Reformation first occurred, there were Protestants that were, because obviously most of the center of the movement was in Germany at the time, part of the Holy Roman Empire, and you've got the Catholic Emperor Charles V. There were Protestants who were literally saying maybe we could ally with the Ottoman Turks against the Catholic Emperor, because
And
and then not only that, there was another instance of when Elizabeth I, Queen of England, was trying to find allies against Spain. She even reached out to the Sultanate of Morocco in North Africa, and I actually remember the Moroccan ambassador said to Elizabeth, "Well, there are some similarities, both Islam and Protestantism. We don't like idols, so we're both righteous iconoclasts."
they're not entirely wrong. They're not entirely wrong in the sense that, like, Calvinism, like very very strict Unitarian Calvinism, and Islam do have very quite common similarities, and this was obviously explored by oh damn it, what's his name? Thomas no, Thomas Carlyle, by Carlyle. Yes, Carlyle explored this as well, and Heroes and Hero Worship.
Oh yes, of course he's looking at Cromwell as the great man as king.
And compares him to Muhammad.
Yeah, so the hero as prophet, certainly, and so yeah, so move on from there. So in terms of the involvement, obviously thus far Kedourie only really spoken about the sort of political influence. And I think we should provide some context as to how this was possible, because in the 19th century, obviously the Ottoman Empire was in a state of stagnation and decline. It was very famously Tsar Nicholas I of Russia referred to it as the sick man of Europe. And as a result, what would end up happening is these great powers would intervene to prop up the Ottoman Empire against Russian expansionism, as part of the system of the concert of Europe, because Metternich, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, decided to treat the Ottoman Empire as one of these old traditional great powers, which had to be preserved along with the order in Europe. And so the Ottoman Empire would get largely support and aid from Europe, but it then had to take Europe's advice, so to speak, and later on not just advice, but even financial aid and investments, and even having its debt bought up and its whole finances taken over by Europeans, essentially.
Yes, the council of managing the foreign debt.
Yes, the OPDA, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. And I've got this map up here detailing the secret treaties of World War One. So obviously we all know the Sykes-Picot agreement. So we've got the pink there for the British and the blue there for the French. And because this, I think, is the main avenue of critique against the involvement of Western powers in the Middle East, that, you're just imperialists, you just want to carve up this map and be rather arbitrary. But I kind of want to get your sort of opinion on this, Hunger, because from Kedourie's view, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because as long as the imperial power is prepared to rule and actually govern, then that's fine. And I think he's correct there to an extent. And what's also more interesting is, because obviously you look at this map, obviously the final borders were nothing like this, because one, obviously in the Turkish War of Independence, Turkey was able to assert itself, and so huge blue area that's in Turkey was not given to France, so France had to make do with just Syria and Lebanon, and later the British were able to coerce Mosul out of them because they wanted the oil that was there. But what's also noteworthy is obviously you see that yellow block in the east of Turkey and around Constantinople. Well, that was the territory which Britain and France promised to Russia in the cover of the Ottoman Empire. So what's rather interesting is essentially Russia was going to be granted a greater Armenia. I mean, if one thing, that certainly, I think, may have led to a better result for the Armenians in the long durée of history.
I think that would have been a much better future for all the peoples there. Maybe it wasn't the best idea to have the Soviet Union along the borders of Iraq and Syria. Maybe that would not have been a good idea. But the protection of the Armenian population, after the genocide, that would have been prevented if the Ottoman Empire had collapsed the way it did, but it didn't. And there were many details that went into that. But I do want to say one thing about this map, because it's a very interesting map, and you can see in some sense that this obviously didn't happen. This obviously didn't happen, and there were many reasons why it didn't happen. And one of the big reasons why this map didn't come into existence is because the British had made, because the British were the primary actors here, they had made promises to not only the Arabs, they had also made promises to the French and made promises to the Jews in the Balfour Declaration. And so the interaction of these three, obligations that the British had to satisfy these three different parties, created a very unstable situation that not everybody could be satisfied. And it led to many things that, we are still feeling today, with most obviously so with the creation of Israel and with the creation of the modern Arab states that came out of this map.
No, certainly. And another point I want to bring up is you can almost argue that the Middle East potentially could have been a repeat of what happened to Africa, because in the 19th century you have the scramble for Africa, where the various European powers are carving up the dark continent, so to speak, because they all want their own sphere of influence in Africa. And they even organised, the Congress of Berlin in 1885 to manage and these different tensions and rivalries by mutually carving up Africa. And you can almost say the same's happening with the Middle East. As just because the British, the French, and the Russians are all allies, so to speak, there were still tensions, different rivalries, and they all had different goals. And the one really interesting thing about this map is obviously, as I mentioned, that originally the French were going to get the northern section of Iraq where Mosul was, but the British got that. And I think the one major reason why I think that changed and why the French even got that area to begin with was because the French were very much, I think, the linchpin of the entente between the British, the French, and the Russians, because they had separate alliances or agreements with both the British and Russians, and they were the ones who finally got the British and Russians, who had been rivals throughout the 19th century during the Great Game, to finally set aside their differences. And I see the French in Mosul as essentially a physical block preventing the Russian and British empires from physically touching one another, just in case tensions and rivalries were to spill out into hostility, so shall we say.
Yes, and we should definitely mention, because this is very important, that going back to your earlier point, it's like, oh, this imperialism is not always a bad thing, and I agree, it's absolutely not always a bad thing, as long as the territories are administered, very well, and they're very well governed. And the reason this map is here is because you have to go back to the time period of 1916 or 1915. You're already a year or two into World War One. The Turks, aka the Ottomans, have sided with the Germans and are building building the Berlin-Baghdad railway, which is an extremely important geostrategic, infrastructure. It's just like Russians building pipelines all over Europe and all over the East Mediterranean. This is a very important geostrategic fact that the British and the French have to deal with the Ottoman-German alliance in 1915. And on top of that, you have to think that the British had the Viceroy of India. India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And so if you wanted to protect India, you had to, settle down the Middle East. Obviously, one with the Suez Canal, the joint French-British investment in the Suez Canal, but more importantly, the British takeover of Egypt and later on Sudan with Lord Kirchner. This was the great game. The great game of geopolitics, with the British Empire having to link the homeland and India through the Middle East, and particularly Egypt, Palestine, and Arabia.
Thank you. And yes, because the certain control of waterways, for example, Basra is a major port on the Persian Gulf. And because remember, also by taking Iraq, you essentially flank Iran from two sides, because the British also control Pakistan as part of India, and also they have a tributary vassal state in Afghanistan. And remember, the British have the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in Iran, extracting the fuel of their empire throughout all of this. And what's also interesting, because a lot of this is also, you could say, the consequence of a certain decision made by a certain First Lord of the Admiralty about 2 years before World War One. I think you know who I'm referring to, Hunker.
I generally do not. Please tell me.
Well, the First Lord of the Admiralty, in the just before World
Lord
War
Churchill.
One. Yeah. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes, because Churchill, when he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, so effectively the civilian head of the Royal Navy, he made a key decision while he was obviously in that position. Because before 1912, the Royal Navy was operating on coal, and he made the decision to switch it over to oil in 1912.
Yes.
And yes, and obviously that would have significant consequences. And there was a justification Churchill gave for that, and I just want to quote him directly. So, to quote Churchill, "To build any large additional number of oil-burning ships meant basing our naval supremacy upon oil, but oil was not found in appreciable quantities in our islands. If we required it, we must carry it by sea in peace or war from distant countries. We had, on the other hand, the finest supply of the best steam coal in the world, safe in our mines under our own land. To commit the navy irrevocably to oil was indeed to take arms against a sea of troubles. Yet, if the difficulties and risk could be surmounted, we should be able to raise the whole power and efficiency of the navy to a definitively higher level. Better ships, better crews, higher economies, more intense forms of war power. In a word, mastery itself was the prize of the venture. So, as you can see, Winston Churchill was certainly ambitious, and I just think it compounds how much of a complete failure he was to preserve and defend the British Empire.
Oh, and indeed, nothing can beat that sweet Welsh coal. Nothing beats it. But I did want to add one more thing to this map, and the interesting facet of the British, being the Great British Empire, they were always playing this great game, and it wasn't just that the Ottomans were an enemy in the First World War. They were also scheming against their own allies like the Russians, and the reason for that was it wasn't just the Russians had this goal of reaching Tibet and reaching India through Central Asia, and this was part of the Great Game. This was the reason why the British invaded Afghanistan. This is the reason why the British were linking up with the Persians and the Iranian Oil Company. And on this map, you can see the yellow, obviously, is Russia coming down through the Caucasus, through Georgia and Armenia, into eastern Anatolia, down on the border of Iraq. And you see the British coming up through the Persian Gulf into Basra and into central Iraq and reaching Baghdad. This was a joint Russian-British expedition, and you can read about this in the book The Ottoman Endgame by Sean McMeekin, and he talks about this joint British and Russian plan. It wasn't even coordinated. They were not coordinating with each other.
No, and I'm really glad you brought that book up, because there is an amazing passage in that book by McMeekin where he talks about Sykes-Picot and his kind of disdain for the traditional
Allies, and they were never directly fighting each other. This was still part of the great game of blocking the Russians.
Oh no, absolutely, oh, I think we might have lagged there. Did you get what I said just before now?
No, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Sorry, because you were speaking, then I think you cut out, so I thought you finished and I spoke, and then you spoke again.
No, just repeat what you were saying. I didn't catch it.
Oh, because I'm glad you brought up that book by McMeekin, because I've also read that, and there's an amazing passage where he really rips into the popular presentation of Sykes-Picot as just only being the British and French having imperial ambitions for the Middle East. And to kind of paraphrase McMeekin, he brings up that famous scene of Lawrence of Arabia where you've got a dumbfounded Lawrence, and Mr. Dryden has to explain to him, well, you see, Mr. Sykes is a British civil servant and Monsieur Picot is a French civil servant, and together they've made a plan to carve up the Middle East between themselves. And McMeekin says, no, this is completely a misrepresentation, because it shouldn't be called Sykes-Picot. It should be called Sykes-Picot-Sazonov, because the Russians were just as guilty as wanting to carve up the Middle East. And I love throughout the rest of the book, he insists on calling it the Sykes-Picot-Sazonov Agreement.
No, yeah, he's very autistic in that sense. And going back to Kedourie, the interesting thing about Kedourie is that he preceded that book by decades, and he mentions the Sazonov connection and how a large piece of the problem of the Middle East was that it was just Britain versus France. The British were funding Arab nationalism to kick out the French. The French were helping, Zionist organizations and funding Zionist organizations to kick out the British. The problem with that situation was if Russia had entered, the arena and taken over Mosul and the north and the eastern Caucasus, the northeastern Caucasus, it would have been a tripartite arrangement, and it would have been two parties against one. The British and the French and the Russians would have teamed up against each other, and that would have been a much more stable situation. It goes back to the stability of like the British, French, German, pact in Europe. Not pact, but like the tripartite system was a more stable geopolitical organization that allowed each one to have a sphere of influence and always had the threat of two ganging up on one. Whereas if it's just two players on the field, it's winner take all. The British are determined to drive out the French from the Middle East and be the sole, sole great power in that region.
Mm. No, because it's almost like the superpower system is unstable because you just have two juggernauts that just hate each other, and then the whole world is just locked into a state of constant like fear and tension, essentially. And also, we forget to mention them till now, but obviously on this map you see there was a sizable Italian concession as well, where the Italians were going to be granted as part of the Treaty of London, the treaty where Britain managed to rope the Italians into World War One. That other than giving them their promising them their territories in the Dalmatia region and in the Istria and in South Tyrol in Europe, up from Austria-Hungary, they were also promised a sizable chunk of southwestern Turkey. And we must remember that just before World War One, you have the Italo-Turkish War, where Italy humiliates the Ottoman Empire by taking from them Libya and also the Dodecanese Islands roads in the Aegean. So you almost can see this as an extension of that previous Italian policy, and so it would have been like a quad division of the Middle East, if you like, and perhaps if that happened, maybe you wouldn't have had a big chin man come to power in Italy.
Yeah, but no one cares about the Italian campaign in World War One.
Well, I find it interesting, if not for darkly tragic reasons. But
I'm kidding, obviously, but obviously that didn't happen. The Italians withdrew, and Turkey was granted back Alexandretta. Obviously, it became a part of the national borders of Turkey. Was it the Treaty of Constantinople, or was it Luzerne? I believe it was Luzerne.
There were two. The Treaty of Sèvres, which was the first treaty, which is the one that basically they gave Turkey a rump state in the middle of Anatolia. While obviously this was a revision of what we've had now, because obviously by that point the Russians had the revolution and had bowed out of the war, and also by that point the Italians had bailed. So in that one, you've got the rump Anatolia, you've got the Greeks occupying Smyrna in Western Anatolia. The British themselves were occupying Constantinople, and then the French still had their sizable concessions in the southeast. And then there was in that Russian segment in Greater Armenia, there was actually a possible Kurdish state that was being looked at as well. So still pretty grim for the Turks. And then obviously Ataturk and the nationalists were able to turn that around. And then you have the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which is the one that recognises the Republic of Turkey. And just to very quickly go back to the state of Constantinople, I'm going to echo something Apostolic Majesty mentioned on the stream he did with Marcus about the Greek War of Independence. So not Greek War of Independence, sorry, the Greco-Turkish War, where essentially, because even though the British and French had promised Constantinople to the Russians, I don't believe that Britain would have sincerely have handed it over to them, because remember, Gallipoli was an Anglo-French military endeavour. The Russians didn't really do anything to help take Gallipoli at all, which is one of the reasons why I think it was a failure. And I really don't see the British just handing over something that they'd fought and sweated over, especially such an important naval base, because remember, the Dardanelles block Russian access to the Mediterranean. So I'm going to actually echo an expression sort of coined on that stream of his, which is like where you have the in the 13th century the carving up of the Byzantine Empire into the Franco-Kratia. In the 20th century, you would almost have this Britanno-Kratia, with the British putting themselves as masters of the Dardanelles, lording it over the region.
Indeed, and obviously at this time, post-revolutionary Russia, Russia was very much contained in the Black Sea. The Turkish Navy was a force to be reckoned with at that time, and they obviously withstood Churchill and the Gallipoli landings, as well as the Russian Black Sea Fleet at that time. But very 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 under discussed, very undiscussed time during these events is the 1920 Greek expedition, and how Greek forces, obviously being Greece being a French, British, Russian protectorate, not protectorate, creation. Uh, Greece being a British, French, Russian creation, they took over huge swaths of Western Turkey, and this is where Ataturk famously rises to power and kicks out the Greek expeditionary force that was trying to retake, the former Byzantine Empire and the Greek areas of Western Turkey. This is where you get the millions of ethnic cleansings. There were millions of Greeks, of Orthodox Christians, still living in Western Turkey, and there were still Muslims living on the Greek islands as well. So this is where you get the final borders of Greece and Turkey, where there's a huge population transfer of Muslims and Christians across to the other country. And obviously, this is how Ataturk gets his start as the dictator of Turkey, and being a national hero.
Indeed, and sadly, even though that war was formally ended a century ago, I still think there are still long-running tensions which echo into this day, especially when you consider that both Greece and Turkey are members of NATO. It's pretty bonkers.
It's absolutely insane. It makes no sense, but that's for another conversation.
No, indeed, and yes, and so the next thing, sort of going back to Kedourie, is he sort of then comments on the British intellectual circle's sort of deep sense of guilt for Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration. And there's another reading that I just want to do. I just need to find the page. Okay. The other circumstance which has confirmed the current picture of the modern Middle Eastern history as it obtains in Britain is the outcome of an accident, the consequences of which are prodigious and inexhaustible. The accident is the involvement of Lawrence and his friends in the British Middle Eastern policy. Lawrence was an outsider who suddenly rose to fame and power in the space of a very few years. He had neither the esprit de corps nor the understanding of the state's position and interests which comes from the constant and regular practice of government and diplomatic negotiation. His impassioned apologetic was therefore violently eccentric and out of all relation to the facts. This in itself is not surprising. What is surprising is that powerful and influential men, neither outsiders nor eccentrics, accepted and embraced a version of history so subversive of their country's position and so contemptuous of traditional instruments of its welfare, such as the army and the civil service. The burden of Lawrence's complaint and the refrain of his party was that a great act of injustice had been committed against the Arabs by reactionary politicians and their ridiculous civil servants. This had happened because these men were ignorant of the new forces in the East and because of their criminal weakness in the face of the satanic designs of France. Lawrence and his friends spoke not as mere students of politics, but with authority. They had been there in the New East, they were acquainted with the new men, and they recommended them heartily to the British public. And this again is a matter for surprise. What surprises not so much Lawrence's own extravagance as that of his friends, who took up and sponsored little conspiratorial offices devoid of political style and filled with tedious political fanaticisms. So, as you can see there, Kedourie is no fan of T. Lawrence of Arabia. He considered him to be a dangerous young sort of fantasist. And what's your mate make of all of that, Hunker?
Yeah, no, Kedourie believes he was a very self-serving. He's a very T.E. Lawrence. He's a very modern character. He has, we obviously, I'm sure we've all seen the movie. It's the incredible movie Lawrence of Arabia, directed by David Lean. Incredible movie, but like even through all the other accounts, he was very much a modern character in the sense that he had this, narcissism and visions of grandeur, and he wanted to be this great adventurer that conquered, not even conquered a territory, that helped an oppressed people liberate themselves from oppression. This is a very modern story, and why Lawrence and his adventures in Arabia still echo culturally in the West.
Yes, and that's very fitting because to tie this back to the stream I had last week with Alexander Adams on art and romanticism, I discuss obviously the ideas of romanticism, but one of the paintings I discussed with Alexander was the very famous one of Lord Byron on his deathbed, and it's obviously famously Lord Byron was one of the champions of the Romantic movement, and he went over and fought in the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. So you've got the beginnings of sort of romantic nationalism and the idea that it's not your sort of your station in life that's important; it's the nobleness of your deeds and character. And you've kind of got this honoration of Lord Byron in this painting. He's lying on this sort of his deathbed, and he's got wearing the laurel wreath, and he's done it like a Greek hero. And you can almost say the same of Lawrence, that he wants to be this romantic hero. And the idea of nobleness of character is very, and not necessarily nobility of birth, is very critical to Lawrence, because as some of you may not be aware, that Lawrence was actually believed to be a bastard, because his father, I think, was actually an aristocrat, but his mother and his parents weren't married. And I think that was something, at least it's presented in the film Lawrence of Arabia, something that he was a bit conscious of. And so by coming to this new exotic land, he can kind of make a name for himself and perhaps step over the past, so to speak.
What was the quote from Churchill? The East is a career.
That was actually Disraeli.
Disraeli, yeah. The East is a career. It's very fitting in the case of Lawrence.
No, indeed. Though, speaking of that, Lawrence did eventually end up serving when under Churchill in the Colonial Office when Churchill was Colonial Secretary in the aftermath of World War One, actually implementing the British administration of these new territories.
If I recall correctly, I believe he was very unhappy with his position post, the Arab rebellion in the desert. He was not a great civil servant or team player, from if I recall correctly. Am I getting that right? Do you have any more on that?
Well, I remember in the book, me and Prudentialist went over for the 2 streams I did with him on Sykes-Picot. James Barr does talk about Lawrence. Yeah, he does mention that Lawrence was kind of a bit depressed when he was just relegated to like this office job, because I think Lawrence really thrived in being this guerrilla leader in the desert, or being at like the Paris Peace Conference. But now it's just like, okay, you've now got to do boring office work in like London. I think I don't think he enjoys it, which, like, to be fair, I can understand why.
Yeah, no, he was a very powerful cultural image for, like, going native. This was very much an American phenomenon of white settlers joining Native Americans, and Lawrence is a very big character in the opposite direction of a British civil servant going on wild Eastern adventures, and that, yeah, he's a big case of going native.
I will say, because I've not read the Seven Pillars of Wisdom directly, but one of my understandings of one of the problems with understanding Lawrence is that a lot of our opinion of him comes from the film Lawrence of Arabia, which is a great and fantastic film. It's one of the best films ever made in modern times. However, certain things are, I think, exaggerated or embellished, and this whole idea of Lawrence going native, I do think, is a little bit over-exaggerated in that film.
I could see that. No, yeah, that's a fair point.
And yeah, so just to move on, and then in the essay, Kedourie sort of moves on to this idea that Western intellectuals, they kind of see the 2 issues that are stopping the Middle East from being a stable and peaceful region is imperialism and Zionism, and but Kedourie says in his opinion that even if the Zionist threat was to be removed, this removes a mutual enemy of many of the Arab states.
No, indeed, and the Arabs would squabble against each other. You would have like the emergence of like regional rivalries, and like even to this day, there are still very very clear examples of regional rivalries. While the Arabs were at war with Israel on many occasions, the Egyptians and the Syrians were fighting over the primacy of who is the leader of Arab nationalism. This was a very big not fight. They never engaged in conflict over this, but there was a lot of cultural, soft power conflict between Syrians and Egyptians. Egypt had Gamal Abdel Nasser, and they had this huge cultural impact and weight on what is Arab nationalism. And there's even like debates between the Egyptian intellectuals and Syrian intellectuals. The Syrian intellectuals who I'm sad to say, were mostly Orthodox Christians, founded the Ba'ath Party and founded, their own version of Arab nationalism. And the idea of the idea of Arab nationalism, it's it never fully made sense. And so you obviously had these different, influences of why are there so many monarchies and so many post-Soviet, dictatorial republics, and they all claim to be, pro-Arab and for the Arabs, but these are just competing ideologies that captured certain territories and certain parties. And this would have been much more heavily, there would have been much more conflict between the Arabs themselves, even if the Zionist presence wasn't there. I mean, we cannot deny that the Zionist presence is a very big problem and a very big stumbling block to stability. It is absolutely a problem that does prevent, you know, a more reasonable peace. But because again, because we're both realists and Kaduri is a realist, that doesn't mean the Middle East would have been, a solved issue, and that it would have been it would have been as peaceful and prosperous. It might have been a better. I can imagine it would have been a much better society, but that doesn't mean it would have been, you know, as it would have been as grand as what the Orientalists believed it could be.
No, absolutely. And just to go back to this idea of Arab nationalism, I also think it's important that there is another synonymous term, which is Arab socialism. And I think the reason that this term actually has any relevance is because of the Cold War. Obviously, the Soviet Union being one of the great powers that has an interest in influencing the Middle East. I think a lot of these Arab nationalists called themselves Arab socialists, I think purely just to garner sympathy from the USSR, but perhaps to dupe them into thinking, oh, we're not supporting reactionaries, we're supporting good-hearted socialists against American capitalist imperialism.
Oh, absolutely, and this is what makes Kaduri also stand out among, commenters on Arab affairs. It's that, he says in the book, you didn't replace British and French imperialism with liberation. You replaced it with a proxy war between the Americans and the Soviets. This obviously power creates a vacuum, and once once the imperial system withdrew from the Middle East, the vacuum is filled with Soviet funding and weapons. Like, why is every other tank in the Middle East a T-72? The Middle East was the testing ground for American Soviet weapons and weapons in combat. The Israelis obviously received American weapons, and the Arabs obviously received Soviet weapons. And so you never really replaced freedom and liberalism and national identity. No, you just replaced it with a proxy war between the Americans and the Soviets.
Yeah, indeed. And there is a stream on this channel from a few months ago where I read John Bagot Glubb's little pamphlet called "The Middle East Crisis," which is his reaction to the Six-Day War. And his assertion was that the Six-Day War was simply started by the Soviets by them giving intelligence to the Egyptians that Israel was about to attack Syria, and that the results of that war massively boomed the Soviets, because what happened, both of the humiliated Arab powers massively slid even more under Soviet influence. So I can certainly see the thesis as the Soviets gained significantly from that course of events.
Absolutely, especially the Soviets were instrumental in propping up Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and they built, I believe it was the Anwar Dam. There's an enormous, very famous dam on the Nile River in Egypt that was
The
built
Aswan Dam.
in the late 50s. Yes, it's enormous. It's huge. It's the largest dam in Egypt, and it was for many decades. And this was entirely funded by the Soviets. And this was and Gamal Abdel Nasser was, and for better or worse, a mini Soviet client. And it was and he was interesting fact that he was supported by both America and the Soviets in the Suez Crisis against the evil imperialist France and Britain, and obviously Israel.
I think perhaps the only time the US State Department has imposed Israel on anything.
Yeah, shocking.
Mm. And yes, just to go back to this idea of imperialism. So Kedourie says, well, when looking at these people, what does imperialism mean? Does it just mean not having, imperial powers of Britain and France involved, or does it just mean not having any great power involvement at all? And he says, well, the problem is if you go with the first definition, well, that's redundant because the Soviets and Americans have taken over. And then the second one is completely absurd because the reality is you always are going to have great powers that have interests, and that's something you're never going to get away from.
No, absolutely, and he was very realist about that. I did want to bring up one other thing, and another thing I like about Kaduri. It's that he he describes how Arab nationalism, and the thinking of the Arabs at the time, because the Arabs are a guilty party in this as well. It's not purely a British, blunder. It's the Arabs are very much involved in their own demise in some ways, and he because they're infected in many cases by Western ideas. And I wanted to read this passage on how the Middle East became much worse as a society and a nation after the introduction of Arab independence and Arab nationalism that was obviously encouraged by Western ideas. And I'm going to read this one passage very briefly.
Sure.
Another modern development which tends in the same direction is an outcome of Westernization. European administrative techniques have been put at the disposal of the local governments, who have been thus enabled, as never before, to exert a minute systematic control over social and economic activities. New methods of importing licensing, exchange control, and fiscal supervision have made private persons quite dependent on the goodwill of those in authority, who are able, when they choose, to punish the object of their malice and ill will swiftly and effectively. It is by such means that the Iraqi government was able efficiently to spoil and loot the Jews of Iraq, and by similar means that the government of Egypt has been able recently to follow in its footsteps. This new power of government makes even more complete the dependence of the economic on the political, and must thus hinder the emergence of the independent middle class on which so much hope is set. This increase in the power of government affects not only the economic sphere, but extends in all directions. The modernization of society in the Middle East has not been the result of private initiative and the gradual adaptation of a local tradition to changing conditions. Rather, it has been imposed from above by decree and implemented as far as possible by officials. This meant that the traditional articulation of Middle Eastern society had either to bend to the will of the reformer or be completely dislocated. Such has been the fate of Muslim as well as non Muslim religions and communal organizations, of provincial particularism, of local and vested interests. Individuals are now equal under the law, corporations the creatures of statute, and law and statute the irresistible will of a central and sovereign authority. So what he's saying in very very briefly is the introduction of Western techniques of management, the introduction of Western managerialism that came riding along Arab nationalism. They went hand in hand very easily, led to more tyranny by government authorities. When the Ottoman Empire had, under the system of the Ottoman Empire, you had the jizya, you had the local Ottoman administrators, you had the regions and their governance, but they never exerted the control that modern states had. There were many blind spots, and this was a very mercantile merchant class and society of people, and that the introduction of Arab nationalism and administrative managerialism diminished the freedom and economic activity of all the individuals involved under the state. And because authoritarianism, even though the Middle East has always been somewhat authoritarian, it's never been as authoritarian as this. It's the freedom of individual people economically or socially has been much reduced, because of the introduction of these things and because of the centralization of governmental authority. Governmental authority always consumes all other authorities around it, whether that be religious, economic, social, personal, and that's just another sad state of what's been happening as a result of these things.
No, certainly. And another point of his that he discusses is that there are these Westerners who look at the Middle East and they think, well, the middle class is rising in its wealth, therefore democracy is only going to follow because the middle class are liberals and they will champion this. And he's like, no, that's not going to happen because these regimes, the economy is under the control of the state and the government. They're not going to allow that to happen. And he's right. The only time you've ever seen any kind of democracy was where it was enforced at bayonet point.
Oh, indeed, yes. And there's a great Moldbug in one of his videos told a great story of how I believe it was British. I believe it was early 1950s Iraq, and they were talking about King Faisal, and one British I don't know, either traveler or high officer was like, "Oh my God, the corruption of Iraq is so high. King Faisal is charging a 5% import tax on every ship that crosses the port of Basra," and like I was just like, "That's so cute." Oh wow, the king and his family get a 5% kickback, and trade is flowing freely, and people are engaging in economic activity and businesses booming, as opposed to what Saddam did, confiscating literally everything under the sun and becoming who Saddam was.
Hmm. I think that's very interesting because AA did a stream recently with George Bagby on the idea of will America collapse or not, and I remember him referencing some older street videos he did on the economic policies that ruined various third world countries, and when looking at Africa, one thing he pointed out was that even though you get countries like Uganda or Ethiopia, in a lot of these countries, there are multiple tribes, and often what it is, they're not national governments. It's just one tribe takes over the government and just uses it to loot and extort all the other tribes. And I find it
Yeah.
fascinating that in the Middle East, despite there being a similarity, as in there are many tribes and groups within the Arab world, especially if you go back, because within that original tribe that Muhammad came from, the Quraysh, you've obviously got the Umayyads, you've got the Hashemites, you've got the Abbasids, and all these various other groupings. I find it interesting that in the Middle East you didn't get something similar happen where a specific tribe would just take over and loot, and that Arab nationalism seems to have actually solved the problem of Arab tribalism. You simply just turn all that hatred from within to without, effectively.
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, the Sunnis of Iraq, who were about only a third of the population, I believe, demographically, and obviously Saddam Hussein was an Iraqi Sunni coming from Western Iraq. I believe it's like Anbar province. The Sunnis were very much a privileged class in Iraq, even though everyone was destitute. The Sunnis were very privileged.
Oh,
This is even more true in Syria, where the Alawites are a very privileged class, even though they're an absolutely tiny minority of like 5 to 10% of the Syrian population.
I suppose that's fair, but I was kind of going at it from a more ethnic than necessarily religious angle. But I suppose that's a fair critique.
Yeah, I mean, like, again, when it comes to the Middle East, ethno-sectarian divisions are very much they go hand in hand. That might not be the case in Africa, but in the Middle East, your sect is very much tied to your ethnicity.
Something tells me I've probably triggered many Middle Easterners by comparing them to Africans.
I take no offense. I mean, there are different levels to the third world. Okay, not every third world shithole is like every other third world shithole. That's just all I'll say.
Indeed, and I just want to address a couple of comments in the chat. So, uh, our good friend Nami El Kazan, in my opinion, Arab nationalism is a sort of oxymoron. Arabs are sectarian before being nationalist, which is why we will never have stability in the ME with the current nations. Um, yeah, I would agree with that to an extent. you sort of, so in your view, they're sort of taking that tribalism, like I said, and they're just pushing it without then rather than suffering from within.
I would definitely agree with Nami El Kazim, and the reason I say that is because when you have a multi-ethnic society, nationalism is never going to satisfy anybody. No one will be satisfied, and you're immediately creating a very violent power struggle in the process of that. And the only thing that solves multi-ethnic, you know, peace and prosperity is empire and imperialism, like the Austrians, like the Russians, like the Arabs. No, not the well, maybe less so in the Arabs, but there have been the Ottomans. There have been many multi-ethnic empires that had stability for centuries, and I definitely see that being the case. And I think the solution to Middle Eastern sectarianism is more empire, not less.
Absolutely. And another comment from Namil Kazan. Huntington dives deeply into the modernization of the Third World. According to him, to modernize a nation must first westernize. This in turn destabilizes the social fabric of the nation. 100% agree with you there on that, Nami, because well, for example, we mentioned Ataturk earlier. I think he really was the very first example of this. A leader of a quote Asian country, so to speak, who, in my opinion, essentially modernization. Well, it's really westernization, because what does Ataturk do? He completely guts the old Turkish language of all of its Arabic and Persian influence, and instead forces it to use the Latin script, which unfortunately led to the loss of a lot of older Turkish literature and poetry, and also his clothing reforms, forcing everybody to wear Western dress, etc. Also doing a lot of legal and political reforms. Another example in the Middle East, you've got Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, as well as his father, Reza Shah. Both of them forced extreme modernization. I remember AA saying at one point that Reza Shah literally abolished being a serf in rural Iran. That you can't be a tribesman in the mountains anymore. You have to come to the city and be a modern citizen. And
Yeah, no, but sorry, going back to Ataturk, you were absolutely correct on that point. What it's not just that Ataturk, destroyed the Turkish language and made it a Latin alphabet. He destroyed the caliphate. The Ottoman Sultan was the caliph of the Muslim world for 300 or 400 years, and that institution, and the Ottomans being Muslim for much longer than 400 years, that entire institution of religious authority over as the guardian of Mecca and Medina was completely abolished, and it was replaced by an atheistic secular state of Turkey, and it was not the fault of Ataturk 100%, but it was a consequence of the Young Turk movement. They didn't like the caliphate. They wanted to be European. They wanted to compete in Europe with European standards, and they believed the caliphate and the religious authority structure of the Ottoman Empire was holding them back from being Western and being modern.
no, no, absolutely. And we talk about nationalism, but they took the Turkish nationalism to an extreme, and this is why you get the conflict with the Greeks and the population exchange, and also the Armenian genocide, quite sadly. And also to further sort of go on from this point, obviously we've said Ataturk and Reza Shah Pahlavi, but just to really emphasize the point Nami's talked about, I also have a bit of an interest. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I actually have a little bit of an interest in other parts of the world as well. And I was recently reading again on.
I'm shocked to hear that. Sorry, I was saying I'm shocked to hear you're interested in other areas besides the Middle East.
Yeah, yes, I know, shocking, but yeah, because I was reading a bit on sort of early Thai history, as niche as that is, because and what's interesting with a country like Thailand is I because they actually, around the time of World War II in the 30s, they actually had a revolution where they overthrew their traditional absolute monarchy, and they moved towards a more modern constitutional monarchy. And this was largely spearheaded by nationalist revolutionary officers in the Thai military. And one of the military leaders of this was a figure called Plaik Theban Songkram. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he would eventually go on to become the Prime Minister of Thailand twice, once from 38 to 44, and again from 50, it was 48 to 57. And he's quite a fascinating figure because he was essentially kind of like a Thai sort of military fasci dictator, and he was enamored with Mussolini, and he basically wanted to turn Thailand into this sort of weird pseudo European fascist dictatorship in Asia. So he did all these things, like he popularized the Roman salute. He also is the one who, because Thailand used to be called Siam, he's the one who asked all other countries to refer to the country as Thailand, and he created this sort of unified national culture and language. And a bit like the mid-century Germans, he found an outgroup to demonize, which were the Chinese descended Thai population as well. So it's just so weird how this modernization and westernization often go hand in hand.
Yeah, no, I'm the modernization of the third world. It's a total tragedy, and it's a big reason why there's so much instability in the third world. And obviously, the spread of westernization and the spread of these ideas did not end well for the people of the region. Even though the reformers came from the region, they were influenced by these ideas. It did not end well for the I would argue, for the local populations they were governing. And that's just a pattern that repeated. Egypt was a monarchy. There was a military officer that overthrew them. Iraq, same thing with King Faisal. There are many of these monarchs were overthrown by their middle officers, lieutenants, and colonels.
And you just remember with Iraq, it wasn't just once but twice, because as it first happened in 41, though that was a failure. So the 1958 coup, which is the one that did successfully overthrow the Hashemite monarchy, did have a pretext in that earlier attempted coup during the Second World War.
Yeah, which is not to say that, I mean, these monarchies were very new. These monarchies were also, a creation of Sykes-Picot and of British and French imperialism, but that doesn't mean they couldn't have worked. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean what replaced them was any better, because it clearly wasn't, given the results.
Well, again, there's actually an issue we haven't really talked about, is how in the modern Middle East there was a tension between Arab nationalism, Arab socialism, because those movements are largely secular. Because in opposition to that, you have pan-Islamism or jihadism, or what's the term they use with the Saudis? It's Wahhabism, isn't it? The specifically, yeah, Wahhabism, and which is this extremely austere version of Islamic ideology, where the Quran in Islam above all else. And because famously, I think in Egypt, you often have, there's that group, the Muslim Brotherhood, which have a couple.
I'm sorry. You cut out. Could you repeat that?
Oh yes, I was just talking about one example of this is in Egypt, you've got the tension between people like Nasser and the Muslim Brotherhood, who have very rarely on occasion been able to temporarily hold power. I think the Muslim Brotherhood, managed at least one prime minister of Egypt, I think just after the Arab Spring, but he was then swiftly removed by the military. So, and then later on, obviously after the collapse of Iraq from the Iraq War, you obviously have ISIS arise in the north of the country, and then they spread into Syria as well. So yeah, it's just this. You can almost say that the pan-Islamism is almost like the native ideology of the Middle East fighting this Western importation that's come in.
No, absolutely, and we might have to speed up to the next chapter, because I'm very happy you brought up pan-Islamism and Wahhabism, because Kedourie talks about this very much. Radical Muslim fundamentalism, and going back. Okay, long story short, when the Arab Revolt kicks off, and the Sharif of Mecca, King Hussein, is having his correspondence with McMahon in Egypt. There's many debates going on between the civil service in Egypt and in Khartoum, Sudan. That is he our guy? Is he reliable? Does he have the legitimacy, the religious legitimacy to kick off the revolt and create a pan-Arab state or empire, create a pan-Arab new caliphate? And one of the things that happened was there were these advisors to King Hussein who were putting out the feelers, with the British. It's like, no, we're not Muslim fanatics. We're normal people. We just want our own state. We just want liberation against the Turks. We don't have any religious, radical motivations going on underneath the surface, and which was completely false. That's completely not what happened at all. And it's just interesting that Kedourie pointed that out, and we should get into that as well in the second chapter.
Oh no, absolutely. And so just to finish up the chapter on the Middle East and the powers, so I'm going to move the slide on. So this is the other slide. So this is interesting. When you're looking at the modern Middle East, you kind of see these two power blocks that have emerged. So on the one hand, you've got the red countries, which are broadly speaking the Western or US aligned Arab countries. So you've got Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and then the Gulf states, so the UAE. And then in opposition, you kind of have these Iran stroke Russia aligned states. So you've got Iran itself, and then you've got Iraq, and then Syria and Lebanon. And now you could very easily say that I think there's a clear religious split here, because Iran obviously is the main Shiite country. Iraq, since the ousting of Saddam Hussein, the government there, I believe, is actually a Shiite government, and obviously Iraq is mostly Shiite. Obviously in Syria, you've got the al-Assad's family, who are Alawites, but the Alawites, from my understanding, are a subdivision of Shiite Islam. And then, of course, you've got Lebanon, where you've got, even though they don't run the entire country, you've obviously got a large military presence in that of the Shiite Islamist group Hezbollah. And then in opposition, obviously, Jordan is a Sunni country, Saudi Arabia is a Sunni country, etc. And then Yemen in the south, which we see is aligned with Iran, they're also Shiite as well, if I recall correctly.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yemen is a Shiite. Sorry, Yemen is a predominantly Shiite country, isn't it?
Yes, so I'll mention this is an accurate enough map. I will, because of my autism, make some corrections. So obviously Iraq, yes, 60%, between 50 to 60% of the Iraqi population is Shia, and obviously sides with Iran. The 30% population is Sunni. That doesn't. I would not categorize them as pro-Western. Like, the Sunnis are for the Sunnis, and they're very much aligned with Saudi Arabia, obviously. But that doesn't mean they're pro-Western or pro-American. But they are clearly a force America has used to counter Iranian influence, and you can see this very clearly in ISIS, which was a creation of the U.S. State Department and CIA, which everyone should know by now. This is not controversial. And the Sunni groups of Western Iraq and the Sunni groups of Eastern Syria linked up to form ISIS, under the former banner of Al Qaeda that broke off from Al Qaeda. So that's one section. These are not as clearly drawn as some people would believe, but it's generally accurate. Lebanon, yes, it might as well be an Iranian proxy, because the government doesn't function and is non-existent, but Hezbollah is very much the big fish in the pond and the greatest power in that country. And Yemen, Yemen is divided between Sunnis and Shias, as many of these countries are, especially in the north. But Yemen is divided between Sunnis and Shias as well. You have in the south, in Aden, I believe it's majority Sunni around that area, and in the north, on the border of Saudi Arabia, are the Houthis, who are obviously Shia. But interesting facet I've been hearing in the past week, actually, it's that the Sunnis in the south in Aden are defecting over to the Houthis in solidarity, because the Gulf states can't directly oppose the Houthis because of the Israel-Palestine situation. They did directly oppose the Houthis, but because there's a very brief renaissance of Arab unity, like for the cause of Palestine once again, that they've had to put some differences, and so the government, the southern Yemeni government, the anti-Houthi government, there's been many large defections going on, and southern Yemen is collapsing into the Houthi cause. So yes, they're going to be far more pro-Iranian aligned than Saudi aligned in the near future.
Mm. And obviously, going back to a point Kedourie made, is the idea that with the Cold War, you had the end of a tri-quadrilateral system of powers to a duopoly. Well, I actually think looking at this map, you can almost say we're seeing a return to a tri-quadrilateral power structure, because obviously you've got the Americans on one side, but against them, though it says Iran, I would also say Russia has a role as well, because there's a significant Russian military presence in Syria, and also the Russians have significant dealings with the Iranians, so it's almost a Russian-Iranian alliance, anti-Western alliance. I think is a fair assessment.
No, that's very much fair, and increasingly over time, especially post Ukraine war, the Iranian Russian positions are converging. They're converging into a single coherent alliance, whereas beforehand, the Iranians and Russians did not get along very well. At least there's a long history of Russians' invasions of Iran, going back to the 18th century. They were very much regional rivals in both Central Asia and the Caucasus. So Russia and Iran were not friends for centuries until very recent decades. And the situation in Syria, where both Iran and Russia supported Bashar al-Assad, definitely converged them together. They started becoming much more friendly in terms of relations. Western sanctions against Iran forced Iran to look towards Russia for more economic opportunities. And that also happened post, I want to say 2010, 2012. That definitely happened as well. And given the war in Ukraine as well, and Russia becoming a huge part of the anti-Western alliance, the Iranian and Russian position is converging around Iran's axis of resistance, which you see here in the north with the Fertile Crescent, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and their allies in Yemen. So this axis of resistance is definitely, an alliance against American spheres of influence. The sad thing is, the sad thing about the U.S. sphere of influence. Yes, these are obviously U.S. spheres of influence. There are literally dozens of American bases here, but with the exception of Israel, none of these Arab states are comfortable with the situation. None of these Arab states are comfortable being a U.S. proxy or being a U.S. puppet. And so that's going to be very interesting how that turns out, because of the situation in Gaza, because of the situation in Palestine, and American insanity and American levels of support, insane levels of support for Israel. So the Arabs are not comfortable with what's happening and with their American partner. And yeah, that's basically the situation on the ground right now.
Well, thank you for that summary. And now I think it's time to move on to the second essay we're going to discuss tonight, which is Cairo and Khartoum on the Arab question, 1915 to 1918. There we go. Okay. So in this essay, you were, before we went live, you were talking about this essay as reading it is kind of like reading a soap opera, and no, I don't think I can fault you for that, because there are, as you can see, there is such a wide cast of characters and drama going on between all these characters. And so the title, Cairo and Khartoum on the Arab question. So this essay, Kedourie is mostly dealing with a lot of the negotiations that are going on between the not so much the British government, but British officials in the Middle East and Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, in trying to stir up the Arab Revolt. And so the key figures for this are, you have G.F. Clayton, who is an intelligence officer for the Arab Bureau, which is a sort of intelligence office that's based in Cairo. You then have Sir Reginald Wingate. He's the Governor General of the Sudan. So a key sort of colonial administrator. We then have Sir Henry MacMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Egypt. So this is essentially the British government's representative in Egypt. And then we've got Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca himself. And essentially, so these three British figures on the left, especially Wingate and MacMahon, who are both the main sort of political figures, they are the ones who are really pushing within the British high command and political system to work with the Arabs. Whereas in contrast to them, you've got other people, like you've got the government of India, for example, is very much against the idea of stirring up an Arab revolt. Because they think, no, it's too risky. Whereas when you're dealing with people like Wingate and MacMahon, because they are in the territory which is directly connected or very close to the area that would be affected, the Middle East, they see it as, well, we've got to support this because this will essentially expand our remit and also make our positions more secure.
No, indeed, and the one character you mentioned, you did mention him by name, but yes, the India office and the India viceroy, and there are many civil servants there, were adamantly opposed to support for Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, and his plan to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And the name of this one particular individual, who was the foil of these three British gentlemen, was Lord Curzon, the Marquis Curzon of Kedliston, and the Marquis of Curzon.
Sorry,
Lord
just to interrupt. Yes. So just to interrupt you quickly. So Lord Curzon is involved in this story, but it's not as the Viceroy of India. So he had been the Viceroy from 1898 to 1905, but by this point he was actually a member of the British government.
No, correct. He was a member of Parliament. He was a very prominent Conservative member of Parliament at the time. He was very much attached to the India office because of his past as the Viceroy.
So at the time, I believe his position was the Lord Privy Seal and leader of the House of Lords. And yes, and you're right, because he was very sceptical of the British position, and I think he would continue to be a bit of a headache for the Arabists, so to speak, because later on he would then become the Foreign Secretary towards the later years of World War One, and I think he even later became Colonial Secretary as well for a time.
I believe he was also involved in the Palestine Mandate. Do I have that correct?
I'm not sure. I know another prominent British politician, Sir Herbert Samuel, Liberal politician and member of the government, did go on to become the first British High Commissioner for Palestine, but I don't believe Curzon was involved in that, so to speak.
Okay. I'm looking at it right now. He was the chief negotiator for the Treaty of Lausanne. That's why, and he oversaw the negotiation over the Palestine Mandate.
Okay, no, fair enough. It must have been when he was the Foreign Secretary then. So to sort of go over Kedourie's view over a lot of these events we're talking about, he essentially says that the British actions in the Middle East are disproportionately agonized over, and a lot of especially the views of people like MacMahon and Wingate are overly sentimental rather than pragmatic, and in fact he actually quotes Henry MacMahon, who himself believed that he was responsible for the Arab Revolt, and there's a quote from MacMahon that Kedourie provides, which I just want to read. So this is a MacMahon. "It was the most unfortunate day in my life when I was left in charge of this Arab movement," he said, "and I think a few words are necessary to explain that this has nothing to do with me. It is purely a military business. It began at the urgent request of Sir Ian Hamilton at Gallipoli. I was begged by the Foreign Office to take immediate action and draw the Arabs out of the war. At that moment, a large portion of the Turkish force at Gallipoli, nearly the whole of the force in Mesopotamia, were Arabs, and the Germans were then spending a large amount of money in detaching the rest of the Arabs. So the situation was that the Arabs were between the two. Could we give them some guarantee of assistance in the future to justify the splitting with the Turks? I was told to do that at once, and in that way I started the Arab movement." So here he's largely referring to the infamous McMahon Hussein correspondence, a series of 10 letters that were sent back and forth between himself and Hussein in the 1915 and 1916. And in these letters, there's various discussions and negotiations as to over what sort of support the British are going to provide an Arab revolt, and what sort of territory and land the British are promising to allow the Arabs to establish in this new caliphate. Because it should be noted that Hussein bin Ali, his role is the Sharif of Mecca. So he's essentially the custodian of the two holy mosques, the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. So his position is a theological one and less a political one. And the plan is to essentially recreate a Arab caliphate in the Middle East with him as this new caliph. And why did the British want to do this? Well, as we mentioned, the Young Turks, which were the leaders of the Ottoman Empire during the war, though being secularist Arab nationalists, they decide it's actually in their interest for this time to flirt with pan-Islamism, because the Ottoman Sultan is the Caliph of Islam, and they want to use Muslim unity to sort of start a holy war to drive the British out of their colonies. And they largely do this at the urging of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, who we've discussed previously, Hunger, was a bit of a Islam simp. And there's something very amusing I have to share when I was doing research for this. Because I was looking up, because Wingate wrote a series of letters and correspondence which was filed away, and they're called the Wingate Papers. And there's like hundreds of boxes of this correspondence that Wingate kept a record of, and I was trying to find some of it to read. Sadly, it's in like Durham University, and there's nothing of it printed to read online. But on their
I saw that as well.
Oh, interesting. Well, anywho, the university kept like a record summary of what's in each box and what each file says. And there was one file that contains some newspaper clippings from the war, and one of the headlines, which had me in stitches, and I actually laughed out loud when I read it. It's an article from the Times, April 1915. The headline reads thus: "His Islamic Majesty William II."
He was very he was not just a Turkophile, he was an Islamophile specifically. Yeah, Wilhelm was a strange character in many ways.
Indeed, he was. So anywho, so seeing this threat from the Central Powers, the British wanted to protect themselves against Islam by essentially making themselves the puppet masters of a weak Caliph, effectively.
Yes, and you mentioned it. The Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, had literally declared a jihad against Britain and against the Allies of World War One, and the British were clearly worried. Governing not just Egypt but India. India had an enormous Muslim population. We call them the Pakistanis today, but they were very concerned about the Muslim uprisings against British rule, particularly in Egypt and India. And this was not an unfounded fear. There had been revolts against British rule in the preceding decade in many such cases.
I'm just going to push back against you slightly. So yes, the Pakistanis are overwhelmingly Muslim. However, Islam is a bit scattered all over India, and there are millions of Indians today who are Muslim and are not Pakistani in any cultural sense.
Yes.
I mean, famously, why does Bangladesh exist as a country? It's because they felt they're Bengali, and they were alienated by the Urdu-speaking Pakistan, which is why they split off and formed their own country. I
apologize for not being racist enough.
Apology accepted. Right, so back to the essay, and I just want to address another comment from Nami. Hussein bin Ali is also the direct descendant of Muhammad, giving him even more religious roots. Yes, no, that is completely true, and that certainly gave him a level of prestige and legitimacy, which he otherwise would not have possessed had he not been. Because this goes all back to a lot of the fitnas during the Arab caliphates, where obviously you have the war between Muawiyah, the first Umayyad caliph, and Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad, who the husband of his daughter Fatima, because he claimed through this connection to Muhammad personally that he had the stronger claim. And so, very important point. So with back to these negotiations itself, and because one of the concerns why the India office was so against it was because they had concerns that it would backfire if it had been unsuccessful, and also it seemed to run very counter to the previous 100 years of the British imperial policy in the Middle East, which was to prop up the Ottoman Empire against Russia. Now we're allying with Russia against the Ottoman Empire. It all seems a little bit counterintuitive.
This is why I called it a soap opera. It's not just that you have, very, very colorful characters with their. It's literally it's very similar. If you haven't seen it, The West Wing. It's very similar to the civil servant fights and office drama within government offices, and it just feels like that kind of incident. Like, we're changing policy, we're doing 180. We were propping up the Ottomans today. Tomorrow we're gonna be destroying the Ottoman Empire and retaking Mecca and Medina for the Arabs. It's like, where did this come from? It very much reads like a comedic drama.
No, it does, absolutely. And I've also got a quote here that Kedourie gets from Reginald Wingate, which I want to read. So, I joined more vehemently, perhaps, than others in the hue and cry against them. Besides, he continued, I had to govern a country in which the very name of Turk stinks in the nostrils of the people. They've been ground under the heel of the Turk and Egyptian. To them, the names are synonymous, and were in close proximity to the Arabs of Arabia, who entertain very similar feelings to their own in regard to their Turkish masters. For these reasons, I, who so warmly supported the Turk on utilitarian grounds, now espouse the Arab cause with still greater warmth and with more real sympathy. So it's an interesting argument for Wingate, because he is the governor of Sudan, which is a country in Africa. It's obviously just to the south of Egypt, and it's largely a Muslim country, and it's kind of got an interesting kind of mixed African Arab heritage, as do many of those countries in the sort of the countries just below North Africa, but just above sub-Saharan Africa, along with others such as Niger and I think Mauritania as well. And so effectively, he's almost like he's saying the people of Sudan are crying out for Islamic liberation of the Arabs against the evil Turk, and I can only do act in their best interests, absurd as that sounds.
No, indeed. The Kedourie throughout this entire chapter, he hits on the point continuously. It wasn't even just. Sir McMahon was clearly instrumental in this, but it was specifically the Khartoum office and Sir Reginald Wingate, who was a prime instigator in starting the Arab Revolt and pushing British foreign policy to support, Sharif Hussein. It's very clear. So it was, and clearly, Mr. Sir Clayton was also working in the Sudan as well. He was working throughout the Middle East, but he was also working in the Sudan under under Sir Wingate.
Yes. The long storied British tradition of espionage, which as Semigog says, goes all the way back to Sir Francis Walsingham and the government of Elizabeth the First. And to be fair, especially if you look at the effectiveness, the British intelligence in World War I, and especially British intelligence in the Second World War, was ruthlessly effective.
No, indeed, and I do want to go back to one point in the sheer comedy of this entire situation. So again, Kedourie is very clear and is straightforward on the fact that the Arabs were not innocent actors. They were not petty victims. They were not totally. They were aware of what they were getting into. It was a conscious decision by Sharif Hussein to start the Arab revolt and kick out the Ottomans so that he could aggrandize himself and his family under a new caliphate, because he was clearly he was the Sharif of Mecca, and Mecca is the most famous city in all of Islam. It's where the pilgrimage happens every year. This is a very important. This is a religious important area that was being supervised under the guardianship of the Ottomans. And I wanted to read this one passage of talking about the communications between Sharif Hussein and the British. And there's so many like there's these very little human psychological, deceptions and double dealings and subterfuge that just really made it, a fascinating drama. And I'm gonna read one brief passage about that.
Mm.
With Wingate's knowledge and approval, hints. Oh, no, sorry. Okay, differently. Saeed Ali al Mirghani, who was then being used as an intermediary in communicating with the Sharif, employed remarkably direct and clear language. In a letter of 17th November 1915, he urged the Sharif to restore to the Arabs the stolen caliphate and the independence and civilization which the Turks had destroyed. The Sharif was to rise and take over the Holy Arabian Qurayshite Caliphate, and there was no man better qualified than him, he wrote. To the Sharif, who knew that his correspondent was an agent of the British. Lost my page 1 second. Who was
No,
it? Yes.
that's
To the
okay.
Sharif, who knew that his correspondent was an agent and not principal. These words must have seemed the categorical, unmistakable confirmation of the ambiguous hints which British official communications had earlier carried. Hussein, therefore, persisted in believing that Britain promised him kingship over all the Arabs together with the caliphate. Since official British promises of Arab independence were addressed exclusively to him, as Horgoth wrote in a paper of March 1918, the Sharif was persuaded that Arab independence necessarily meant unity under him. Since further, the suggestion of an Arab caliphate had come, as he correctly pointed out to Colonel C.E. Wilson, not from him, but from the British, and what is more, had come quite unsolicited. It may well have appeared to Hussein that if these earlier hints were ambiguous, this was only because their authors, as non-Muslims discussing such a matter, did not think it seemly to be more explicit. Oh, I believe we've lost him. Oh, you're back.
Yeah, I knocked my microphone and I got disconnected. Silly mate.
No worries. Did you catch my passage?
I did, yes.
Okay, well, so yes, the Sharif Hussein was totally convinced that the British were sending him hints that, like, yes, you will be the king of all the Arabs, you will rule the grand Arab Qurayshite Caliphate.
Yeah, it's very grandiose, and I think it's interesting. You can kind of see why he would have been tempted, because in almost you could say that you're restoring the tradition and grandness of the past, because if we're going back to the original caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate, which was started after the death of Muhammad by the first Khalifa Abu Bakr, and the original Arab conquests, because the caliphate was centered on the Hejaz region, the western area of Arabia, and the original capital was actually, Mecca and Medina were the core of that caliphate. And then you kind of have this sense of spiritual decline as you get these new caliphates. You have the Umayyads that come in and move the capital to Damascus, and then later you have the Abbasids that move it to first to Baghdad and then later to Samarra, and then you've got the Ottomans who are ruling from Constantinople, and you can almost say that you're seeing this rearticulation of this original Islamic caliphate. So, in a word, it was reject modernity, embrace tradition.
It was absolutely a return.
Return. And
return. I'm gonna read one more passage, because this passage is even funnier, going towards like the misunderstandings and communications between the Sharif and his British interlocutors. And this one very insidious character who ruined the next 100 years of the Middle Eastern history.
Yes, go ahead.
I'll read this passage. Towards the end of 1916, the Sharif had himself proclaimed King of the Arabs. And when the British queried the title, he replied that according to his agents in Cairo, al-Faruqi, remember that name, al-Faruqi, the High Commissioner himself had approved it. Investigation showed that al-Faruqi, to enhance his own importance and the value of his services, had a habit of occasionally reporting to the Sharif interviews with the High Commissioner which had never taken place. And what is even more interesting, that he was apt to put into the mouth of Sir Henry things said to him by more junior people. Since the Sharif himself cancelled written messages by means of oral, it would have seemed natural to him that the British government should use his agent for messages which it did not care to send in writing. I did laugh out loud when he said, "Yeah, I just made up my meetings with with Sir Henry McMahon, and I'm telling you things that never happened," and he never said those things. I genuinely laughed out loud when I read that.
I was like, it's absolutely comical that this is, this is the nature of these serious diplomatic negotiations that were just fabricating meetings that never took place.
This is such an Arab stereotype. It's like, yes, I did speak with this person. Yes, he did tell me these things. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. You never want to appear. You want to appear more important than you really are, and this is such a Arab stereotype. I just found it so funny.
Yes, and it's interesting because Mohammed Sharif al-Faruqi, he was an Arab military officer in the Ottoman military, and he was from Syria. And it's interesting because he was on the more, shall I say, liberal, secular Arab nationalist spectrum than the sort of pan-Islamist spectrum. So I can't help but wonder if he was deliberately trying to sabotage what was going on, perhaps his own ends, maybe.
He was probably looking out for himself and wanted to make himself serviceable to his superiors.
Mm.
It's the tragedy of the servant who goes the extra step for his master, and leads to ruin. If you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I think this is a good point to actually move on to the slide. So this map is the sort of the final territory that was agreed between McMahon and Hussein in their correspondence. So you can see that the British promised McMahon anyway, and al-Faruqi sort of on his behalf very generously. But they finally agree on this, which is McMahon offers to Hussein, right, you will get all of the Arabian Peninsula, all of Iraq, all of Palestine, with the exception of Haifa, the port in the north, which the British will get, and then all of Jordan and the vast bulk of Syria. But you have to let the French have the coast of Lebanon and the coastal part of Syria. And you can understand why Hussein was more than happy to agree to this, because it seems very generous, a bit overly generous, perhaps.
Yes, and you have a huge number of large Arab cities. You have not just Baghdad and Basra. You have Hama, you have Damascus, you have Aleppo, you have these incredible, and you have all of Palestine and all the Palestinian cities and Jerusalem. This is a very large territory with millions of people and very important Ottoman centers and economic zones.
Mm. And yeah, so obviously, this is wildly different to what would actually happen, because as a result of the Arab Revolt, what did Hussein get? He didn't get to become the Grand Caliph of a restored caliphate. He just became the king of the Hejaz. So certainly a better position than what he was before the start of the war, but a far cry from what he was promised. So, and then to top that all,
a far cry from the high expectations.
Yeah, and to top it all off, in the 1920s, Ibn Saud comes knocking and annexes the Hejaz and creates Saudi Arabia.
Tragic.
Yeah, and so obviously
it never ends well for the usurper. It never ends well for the usurper. And Sharif Hussein was a usurper of the Ottoman territories.
There's an expression regarding British politics especially regarding sort of internecine politics of the Tory party, where there's this whoever is generally seen as the one who challenges and brings down the leader, often is the one who never becomes the leader. Like famously, with Thatcher, you had a former cabinet minister, Michael Heseltine. He was the main one for challenging her and bringing her down, but he's the one who never became prime minister. It was John Major, and there's this expression which is the one who wields the knife never wears the crown, and I think that's very true when you look at Hussein bin Ali.
Yeah, no, yes, that's very true.
And now I want to sort of look at the sort of negotiations, as obviously these British officials are like, okay, we've made these grandiose promises to the Arabs. How are we going to reconcile this with what we've already promised the French in the Sykes-Picot Agreement? And there was an attempt to try and walk back some of the promises to the French, but as I went over in my streams of Prudentialist, the French, if you think the British were determined to have a presence in the Middle East, the French were like absolutely inseparable. They were not. They were hungry for the territory. They were not going to be shoved out whatsoever. Because especially
absolutely,
yeah, because the French had long economic ties and links to Lebanon and Syria, and and they absolutely wanted a presence. And so I did mention that the British were able to eventually, very famously, David Lloyd George was able to convince Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, to drop French claims to Mosul in exchange for the British sharing some of the oil that's extracted from Iraq with the French. And of course, what's also interesting is even though the French had originally agreed to the territory of being given all the Syria, Lebanon, and areas of Turkey, that still wasn't enough. They also were adamant for Palestine, and they were convinced for a long time, oh, we'll eventually get Palestine off the British. We deserve the entire Levantine coast, as optimistic as they were being.
Yeah, and you also have to remember, especially at that time, the French were one of the biggest investors ever in the entire Ottoman Empire. They invested, even at that time, they invested millions of francs within the Ottoman Empire, and they were going to be compensated. And because the Ottomans had run up this debt so high, especially in the late 19th century, the debt never really got paid off in full, and the French were very hungry for that compensation, and the Syrian Lebanese coastline. But they took over they took over all of Syria eventually.
No, indeed. And what's also interesting is because MacMahon and Wingate were very anti-Sykes-Picot, understandably, considering what they'd been trying to do with negotiating with Hussein. But eventually, Wingate would just kind of accept Sykes-Picot and be like, well, I guess Hussein should just be happy that we've helped him become independent. And I just was like, you just can't go making these grandiose promises to like this third world, desert leader of this grand empire, and then just how do you sleep at night, essentially?
I mean, just think about it for a second. We literally have three different maps going on. We have the map that was promised to Sharif Hussein. We have the map that was promised between Sykes and Picot, and then we have the third map that was promised to Balfour and the Rothschild family. Like, we have three different maps of the Middle East, all competing with each other. And I think you have an expression in the UK about this. It's a dog's breakfast of like, how do we reconcile these three different promises that we made to all of these people at the same time, and leave everybody satisfied.
Yes, a dog's breakfast is very, very much that position. And I largely think I'm going to go back to Apostolic Majesty's work again, because he's done some streams on the legacy of the British Empire. And one thing he identified in a discussion he did with AA and Semiagog was he thinks one of the problems of the British Empire is this sort of what he calls decentrifugalism, where rather than having this sort of centralized construct, the British Empire was actually quite decentralized. So you have all these regional colonial governors and elite administrators who all have their own schemes and agendas all competing. And this is why it's such a mess, because you've got one set of people negotiating with the Arabs, you've got another set of people negotiating with the Israelis, and then you've got another group of people negotiating with the French, which is why you just get these awfully muddled and contradicting promises.
No, that's absolutely true. You're seeing this in the tension between the Arab Bureau and the High Office in Egypt versus the India and versus the Indian Viceroy. These people are they're communicating to each other over totally different, you know, having totally different circumstances. It's like I have to think about the situation in India. I have to think about the situation in the Sudan and the Hijaz. And these two things are never really reconciled because there's no central authority. Like what I want to know is like, what is the Foreign Office doing this entire time? When you made three different promises. One, the Balfour Declaration. Two, the McMahon Hussein correspondence, and the Sykes-Picot Sazonov at the same time. These are not these are not compatible with each other. Like, it's no surprise when you have, like, again, this very bumbling comedic office drama of civil servants trying to manage this entire situation, that it ends up being an absolute shit show.
Well, no, again, I think this is specifically a British problem, because the academic agent goes on about, we suffer under the omni shambles of a Tory government. Well, I mean, at the time during the war, you'd have a Liberal government for the first half, and then you'd have a Liberal Tory coalition in the second half. But I mean, it's true, it was a complete omni shambles. And what makes it even worse is you talk about this idea of it being a soap opera. I'm not that familiar, but this seems like it could be an episode of the show The Thick of It, which is this. I don't know if you're aware of it. Yes, it's this modern British political drama satire of politics, where you have all these civil servants. Sort of, you could argue it's perhaps a more comedic version of The West Wing, but British as well. And one other point I just want to bring up as well. I also think, when I say it's a specific British problem, is I also think it's a problem of being a, quote, parliamentary democracy, because you have these elections, you then have this group of MPs who, in the British system, it's not like the president in America, where you have you sort of crown your president, and then the president divvies out all the various offices to various party men. I think it's even worse in Britain to some extent, because not only do you divvy it up, but you have to give it to all these various MPs. So, all right, I have to do a deal with you for support, so you get become Chancellor of the Exchequer, you get the Foreign Office, and it's even worse with the British Empire, because again, linking it to this idea of imperial decentrifugalism, you've then got to carve up all these different colonial positions and offices as well, and the problem is, you think you've bought someone off by giving them political office or giving them a colonial position, administrative position, but that's not enough. These people want to stick their oar into policy now, because they actually have a position of authority. They want their 2 cents to be heard when the final policy is being put together.
Yes, and they want to. This is the nature of managerialism. They want to aggrandize themselves. It's like, oh, what would happen what would happen to the Egypt office under the situation of the Sharif Hussein taking over the entire Arabian Peninsula? I mean, clearly the Egypt office would be much more important, regardless of its connection to India and as a conduit through the Suez. It would be. He literally quotes this in the book. Actually, they imagined the Arabian Peninsula, attached to Egypt and Palestine, obviously, would be its own viceroy, with a British, overseer, not directly, as in the case of India. Sharif Hussein would still be their puppet, but they imagine it to be this grandiose viceroy, just as important and powerful as India. And this is the nature of the managerialism in that at that time. They wanted to aggrandize their own managerial positions.
No, certainly, and it's interesting you bring up the idea of this Arab state being ruled as some sort of and having a British viceroy. Well, a really interesting point to bring up is when they were kind of carving up and creating all these new Arab states, and you had the creation of the Mandate for Iraq, there was a uprising against the British in 1920-21, which they cracked down on. And the reason this uprising existed was because there were actually the British kind of double dealed the Arabs again in another way, because there were actually plans to make Iraq part of India and be governed as part of the Indian viceroy and put Indian administrators into Iraq. Why did this happen? And it's because during World War I, when you had the Mesopotamia campaign, who was that campaign fought by? It was the British Indian Army. It was Indian soldiers led by British officers of the Indian military who fought the Turks and had taken and conquered that region. So you can almost say that the Indian officers come in and going, okay, we consent to this mad scheme in the Middle East, but we want our pound of flesh. We want our own little segment of the Middle East, but under our own supervision. And as you can imagine,
they weren't conquering it for Great Britain. They were conquering it for the Indian office.
Yes, and they wanted to find roles for all their little Indian administrators, and you can understand why the Iraqis rose up, because they didn't want to be ruled by a bunch of Pajeets.
No one is more racist against the South Asians than the Arabs. No one is more racist.
No, as you've informed me. Yes, and there's also one final reading I want to do from this chapter, which is Wingate again. Let me just pull it up. So, yeah, it's another quote from Wingate. So, it is noteworthy, he writes, how the members at different periods of Sir R. Wingate's personal staff at Khartoum were distributed subsequently in the Arabic-speaking world. Of his private secretaries, Sir Lee Stack was Governor-General of the Sudan, and Serdar up to the date of his assassination in Cairo. Clayton proceeded on a special mission to Ibn Saud and was chief British representative in Iraq when he died. I followed Clayton as chief secretary, Palestine government. Of our assistants, Sir Kinahan Cornwallis at this time was chief advisor to King Faisal, and after the outbreak of the war, returned as British ambassador to Baghdad. Sir A. Cone Boyd held key posts for a number of years in the Ministry of the Interior in Egypt. Each one of us, he continued, had been given his initiation into Oriental policies and the conduct of public business by the same kindly and experienced chief. And sorry, just to clarify, so that's not from Wingate. That was from Stuart Symes, who was a British administrator in the Middle East, and he was the chief secretary for Palestine. And this is him commenting on Wingate having all these little underlings all sprawled all over the Middle East, and kind of doing his dirty work and bidding to ensure that his policy was carried out.
Yes, it all started in a little office in Khartoum in the Sudan, and his little minions spreading out throughout the Middle East.
Indeed, I can't help but think of him like the Wicked Witch of the West and Wizard of Oz, where he's just letting them all fly out. Fly, my pretties, fly.
That's a great image, by the way. But I do want to talk about very briefly the counterfactual. You know what we mentioned him. We mentioned him in the beginning, but I want to go back to Lord George Curzon, because he was the only sane man in the room, as far as I can tell. He obviously wasn't in the room. He was a member of Parliament at the time. But given his experience, given his connections to the India office, and given his very clear opposition throughout this chapter by Kedourie, his clear opposition to any of these plans. What was the oppositional plan to starting a revolt in the desert? And the Curzon plan was the goal of the opposition was not to destroy the Ottoman Empire. It was to decentralize the Ottoman Empire. They did not want to leave the power vacuum that obviously McMahon and Clayton and others wanted to leave. They wanted a weakened Ottoman Empire that could be easily influenced through regional allies like the Arabs in Mecca and Medina, and that could further British interests while keeping the facade and structure of Ottoman imperialism. And that might have been unstable, but that would have been a much better future than what we had gotten. And I think we should give, you know, Lord Curzon much more credit for being farsighted than his foils.
No, certainly. No, for a very prudent insight, because I think perhaps him being in the central government, he probably had a wider oversight of what was going on and not sort of stuck in one of these regional colonial offices with a much more zoomed in picture, I suppose.
Indeed.
Uh, and yeah, so that was I mean, unless there's anything else you want to bring up, I think that's as much as I had to say on those two essays.
No, I think we covered it pretty well. That was a very expansive conversation. I recommend everybody read both of these two chapters. The first chapter on the great powers is only 10, 12 pages, I believe. It's very short, but it's an extremely, in my opinion, it's extremely reactionary and realist work, and I highly appreciated that. You know, I've been meaning to get around to this book for months, and when I finally picked it up again, it was a breath of fresh air. And the second chapter, the Cairo Khartoum chapter, it does lead, but it does read like an office comedy drama. And there's so many more details that make it just a fascinating period of time and place with these characters, you know, having crazy ideas, trying to make things happen in the real world. You know, it really is a fascinating, entertaining tale.
Mm. I now have got these grandiose ideas. Because out of interest, this is a little bit tangential, but bear with me. But obviously, I mentioned the thick of it earlier. Well, the thick of it was created by sort of British or Scottish sort of writer Armando Iannucci, and one of the other things he's written and filmed was the film The Death of Stalin. Have you seen that by any chance?
Oh, I love the Death of Stalin. That's a great movie.
Yeah, it is. Well, I kind of have this dream now where I want Armando Iannucci to kind of do a Death of Stalin, thick of it type film, but have it set in like this period of the Middle East, and you've got Will Gates and Mark Mahon and Hussein.
That would be incredible because like I said, Mr. Al Farouki and Hussein and his son Faisal is obviously is very much involved in this whole drama. They're all interesting characters in their own right, and they would just add so much comedy with Arab deception and basically lying and subterfuge that would throw so many spanners in the work of what the British are trying to do. It really is a comedy of errors in many ways.
Uh, well, we can dream, can't we? If you're listening, Armando, you do it.
Please, someone will. If no one will, I will try.
Perhaps if we can get enough money together, we'll sponsor it.
We'll make it a play on Broadway and then pick it up as a movie.
A play on Broadway, fantastic. And well, to sort of end the stream, because that was I think some very heavy, serious discussion. I would actually like to end on a more light-hearted note. So I've actually got some quite amusing Middle Eastern clips which we can all watch. So let's start with this one.
I salute your courage, your strength, your indefatigability. I can honestly tell you that there was not a single person to whom I told I was coming to Iraq and hoping to meet with yourself who did not wish me to convey their heartfelt, fraternal greetings and support.
Oh my God, that is George Galloway.
Yes, it's George Galloway in 1994 praising Saddam Hussein.
That was based.
But again, just going back to what Kedourie said about sentimentality towards the Arab, it carries on to this day in someone like a George Galloway, because he also is someone who's massively in the tank for Palestine.
Yeah, he is very much of Edward Said school of Arabism, and I am not. I am not a. He's George Galloway is a very entertaining person, but I disagree vehemently on the qualities of Saddam Hussein.
Yes, well, the Middle East, it's tragically comic, but it's also tragically dark, and I think you have to laugh about these things, otherwise, you'd go insane, wouldn't you?
My two favorite movies. Just going on very briefly. My two favorite movies are The Dictator by Sacha Baron Cohen and Don't Mess with the Zohan. It's just so funny. The Middle East is just inherently funny. You have to laugh or else you'd cry.
I've not actually seen the Dictator, though I have seen Borat, and yeah.
Highly recommend.
I've kind of avoided him because I think Sacha Baron Cohen is a bit of a subversive character, but maybe I'll make an exception for the Dictator.
No. He's a horrible person and a and a Zionist shill supremacist, whatever you want to call it. He is all of those things and deeply subversive. I mean, he's on like the Council of like Anti-Semitism Watch or something like that. But no, I mean, like, his movie. I love his movies. Like, his movies are hilarious. He's an incredible character comedian.
Well, certainly. Well, now for more comic escapades in the Middle East.
Oh, I remember this.
Amazing.
Classic.
It's interesting because I looked this up, and apparently in the Arab world, to hurt someone with a shoe or to throw your shoe is considered an insult, because when Saddam was overthrown, there's a famous image of his statue being dragged through the streets, and all the Iraqis are like smacking it with their shoes, that makes sense.
It's like you would hit like a slave with your shoe.
Based.
Yes, I have seen it happen. Trust me, it happens.
Oh wow. Oh, what's this? Nami. That clip lives rent free in my head. Which one, Nami?
Both.
Yeah, why not both? What else have I got?
So true.
Oh yeah, here's more on Iraq.
We crushed the forces in Saddam International Airport, and we cleaned the whole place of the airport. لا وجود للعلوج الأمريكان في مدينة بغداد.
There is no any trace, no any existence to the American troops or British troops in Baghdad at all.
أبدا.
At all.
Just so comically independent of reality.
I feel so bad for that character. I can never remember his name, but I've seen his meme going around. Not a week goes by that I see his meme going around when it comes to like America, U.S., Ukraine. It's like Zelensky, everything is fine. There are no Russian missiles hitting Kiev, and then just a picture of the Iraqi spokesman. I sadly can never remember his name.
I looked it up. I think it's Mohammed Al Sayed Al Musa or something. He was the Iraq's public information minister during the invasion.
Yeah, no, that was iconic. I was a child at that time, but like that was even at that age, that was just iconic watching CNN at that time.
No, indeed. What else have I got?
There's a group of UK business people, actually, I don't know whether you have come across them, some wonderful guys who they got a brilliant vision to turn CERT into the next, with the help of the municipalities, to turn it into the next Dubai. The only thing they've got to do is clear the dead bodies.
Good old Boris Johnson and his many, many gaffes.
Clear the dead bodies away.
We may have destroyed Libya, but we can turn it into an extra pie. But let's just get rid of all these bodies first, and then we can do it.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
of course, easy.
Yeah, very easy. Okay, well, I hope everybody's enjoyed watching the stream tonight. Obviously, we will be back in the coming weeks and months to go through the rest of the essays in the Chatham House version. So, is there anything you would like to show, Hunker, before we finish?
Nope. You can just follow me on Twitter at HungerDye, DYE, and I'm gonna be enjoying very much so this book, and keep an eye out for current Middle East affairs, because I'm hearing on the Telegram that that things are being bombed on a daily basis in Iraq and Syria. So that's going to be interesting to see where that goes, and what America and Joe Biden are going to be continuing on the great tradition of screwing up Middle Eastern affairs.
Indeed. And in terms of this channel, obviously, other than the other parts of the series which are going to be coming out, I'm not quite sure when the next part will be. Me and Hunger will sort that out. But one planned stream I do know that should be coming up is towards the end of this month, provisionally scheduled for the 24th of February, is I'm going to be having Nathan CJ Hood on, and he and I are going to be talking about Arnold Toynbee and the heroic in history. So if you find that interesting, stay tuned. But thank you, everybody, for listening, and good night.